Okay. So where do we start? Well, we start where we wake up, right? And so I start with when people wake up, because that's something that we can control, right? When people have insomnia, it's very stressful as it gets close to bedtime, right? I have lots of patients in our clinic where their anxiety kind of ramps up as the sun goes down, right? Because it's like another fight, another night of trying to toss and turn and catch whatever kind of sleep you can, right? And so I focus on kind of when you wake up for a couple reasons. One, it's something that we can control, but also it is something that will help stabilize that circadian rhythm that I mentioned early on, that process C, right? Our bodies crave predictability. Our brains are basically predicting machines, right? They're taking in information from the environment and trying to figure out kind of what they should do next so that you can ensure that your metabolic resources are being used appropriately and keeping you alive. And so the more predictable things can be, kind of the better these things work. But also, the circadian rhythm is really important for that alerting signal, right? And so the more that it's thrown off, the harder things become. And so, what I suggest if people are having trouble with their sleep, they try to start with this kind of simple thing of actually setting your clock, setting your internal clock. And so that means maintaining a stable wake time 7 days per week. Now, of course, everyone who hears this is like, what? Like, I like sleeping in on the weekends. And I'm not saying that you can never sleep in on the weekends, right? I mean, first, if you're sleeping in on the weekends all the time and you're sleeping in several hours extra, you might want to take a look at like why you need to do that, right? It suggests that you're carrying a fair amount of sleep debt, which we already know is trouble. And so maybe it's about trying to manage your day if possible. And some of it's not possible. I get that. But also, if you're not having sleep problems, maybe you don't need to keep it stable 7 days a week. I'm saying if you are having kind of problems with insomnia, this is the first thing that you can do to kind of get back on track. And because it both sets your circadian rhythm, but it also sets kind of when your sleep drive starts, right? So that balloon that I mentioned earlier, like it will, give it a reliable time for when it starts inflating. And that can really matter because if you think about the way the balloon builds up with sleepiness, if you sleep in all the way until noon, say on the extreme end, it actually will take longer for that balloon to build up on average over time, right? And so this is a good place to start. But there are also kind of like clear sleep hygiene things that you need to be aware of, right? So I always say, okay, we can do all these things, we can layer these on, and then, but if you drink a cup of coffee right before bedtime, it really undermines the whole system, and that's because caffeine really is, obviously it's the most popular drug that people consume across the world, but it also mimics its chemical structure, which you see here, mimics what we think is this kind of sleepiness that's building up in the brain, right? So I talked about the balloon building up, being filled with sleepiness, but it's actually, we think is filled up with something called adenosine. And adenosine has a very similar chemical structure to this. And so when you drink caffeine, it actually competes with adenosine in your brain for kind of the receptors that it's hitting. And so this is why you can maintain alertness despite the fact that your balloon is continuing to get bigger and bigger. But the other thing is that caffeine actually stays in your system for a long time. And so for most people, it takes about an average of 6 hours for it to get down to half of what it was when you began to consume it. So if you think about if you drink a double espresso, right, and you drink it at 4 p.m., that means at 10 p.m., you would still have a single espresso in your system. And so no surprise, it might be hard to get to sleep, but also it actually impacts your sleep such that it can be more fragmented, not as deep. And so all of those things, lead to an experience that isn't of the highest quality as it could be. Alcohol is the other one, right? Like a nightcap, certainly is helpful for people to fall asleep. It's definitely soporific, right? You drink alcohol, it hits on these GABAergic receptors in your brain, which are really critical for bringing on relaxation, that relaxation feeling, right? But it actually, because it's a chemical, it impacts your brain, where sleep lives, and it can impact the structure of it. So one of the things that happens when you drink alcohol late at night or too close to bedtime, it actually can cause a suppression of REM sleep. Okay. And so a suppression of REM sleep means that you actually end up getting a much higher dose of deep sleep than you otherwise would have. Right. So you're kind of getting more of that deep sleep in the beginning part of the night, where it's already disproportionately there, but it's at kind of a cost of any of the REM sleep that you might have got. Right. And so what that means is that you get this REM rebound later on that kind of leads to more fragmentation across the night. And so your sleep is of a less continuous and thus kind of perceived as of a poorer quality, but also because alcohol is hitting on those GABAergic receptors in your brain that brings on the relaxation. Alcohol comes out of your system over time, and you know what? Your brain notices. It notices that you're not getting that relaxation anymore, and that can kind of lead to an increase in anxiety in the middle of the night. It can also just lead to more awakenings because your brain is not getting that same kind of dampening that it was getting early on in the night. The other thing that's critical for protecting your wind down is kind of appreciating the fact that you need a transition, right? That you need to demarcate when the day is over. So often I see patients where they approach the world in some ways because this is how they're forced to based on their job, or kind of the cultural norms, but it's often where they treat themselves like they're this laptop that I'm speaking into, right? I have this laptop, got my camera on it, I'm doing this talk, but when I close it, when I just close the lid, it just turns off. That's all it takes. And we often treat our brains that way. We treat our bodies that way, but that's not the way in which we were developed, right? We actually, as humans, need to mark when we're doing this transition and actually kind of having a key time where we give ourselves some time to wind down, to end the day, to close the chapter, however you want to think about it, to protect and invest in our ability to get a quality sleep. And so, what can we do? Well, first of all, I always say that you should try to unplug, literally and figuratively, about 2 hours before bedtime. And I think, people get really wrapped up in their lives, and maybe it can't be 2 hours, maybe it has to be an hour, but we'll take what we can get in the investment for sleep, right? And so for some people, I ask them to actually set an alarm, like on your phone, where it's like, okay, this is the wind down alarm. Or, if you have a smart home, some people have that where the lights will dim on a timer, that can help cue when you need to make the transition. It's not only that it's critical for kind of trying to turn down your stress system and allow you to kind of get that relaxation you need to facilitate sleep, but these kind of timing things are actually rituals. They're environmental triggers that tell your body what it's supposed to be doing next. Again, getting back to this predicting, having this as a ritual of, okay, I now stop working, I don't check any more email, I go do things that I find relaxing, and these other rituals that we often do around bedtime, which are important for telling the body what's going to happen next. So whether it's kind of putting on your pajamas, brushing your teeth, doing kind of your skincare, whatever it is that you do. But you want to do something that gets you in this relaxation mode, in the mood for sleep. I say, we focus on things that are low arousal, but also kind of positively valenced. So meaning, you want to kind of do things that are positive, but things that aren't going to get you amped up. So, and when we think of like high versus low arousal, being excited and being relaxed are both positive, but the relaxed, content, calm experience is what we're shooting for. And that can be personal. So I always say that, sleep is universal, but it's also really personal. And so there are things that will work for you that may not work as well for others. So meditation can be a good thing, but also just reading, listening to music, watching TV. But I would say with watching TV, I'm not someone who says you can't do any device. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But you don't want things that are so engaging that you can't let go, right? I mean, you don't want to start like a new Netflix series that is going to keep you coming back and keeping you up all night, because it's really about the engagement that we're trying to kind of lessen. And so that's particularly true when it comes to things like social media. Those are things that are kind of developed to keep you coming back. And so I always try to suggest to folks, if they can, to try to set a limit on when they stop doing that, because you need to allow yourself to calm down and not be so engaged. And then the question is, so I brought up devices, what about blue light? So there's a lot of talk about blue light and its ability to kind of down-regulate melatonin production. And so we worry about that, of course, because melatonin is also one of those things that sets the table to allow you to sleep. Most devices have nighttime filters on them, so I suggest use them. But I also want to be clear that the content probably outweighs the blue light concern. So, if you have the nighttime filter on, but then you're kind of watching, really engaging TikTok videos for, 3-4 hours, it's probably about the TikTok videos and not the fact that there was, you're blocking the blue light, right? And so, you want to be mindful of that. But also, if you can kind of protect yourself from that, that's great. I just don't think it is kind of, it's not a solution that will solve all the issues around sleeping. Okay, so then there's this critical part about the bed, right? So the bed plays such a fundamental role in bringing on sleepiness, right? So people are sleepy typically when they get in bed, but the bed itself, because you sleep in it all the time, is kind of a hammer for kind of bringing on sleepiness. You can think about the opposite of like when people when they sleep in a hotel room for the first time, they don't get that same experience, right? There's something about your bed, your surroundings that can be really helpful in facilitating sleepiness. But what happens when people have trouble sleeping, they often spend a lot of time in bed not sleeping, right? Like they're tossing and turning, they're doing other things, and that can confuse the body, right? And so that is something that we often need to try to figure out and work on so that we can repair that experience. So often I have patients that say things like, I was getting really sleepy and then I got in bed and my brain woke up. Right. And maybe some of you have had that experience that, you feel sleepy, but then your brain just becomes so active when you get in bed. And that's evidence of what's called a conditioned arousal. That occurs because there have been so many instances in your life where you've spent time in bed when you're not sleepy or when you're angsty, kind of you're anxious, you're worrying about the fact that you're not sleeping, you're worrying about things going on in your life. And it can undermine the way the importance and the kind of the environmental trigger aspect of the bed for sleep. So you really want to make your bed a shrine to sleep as much as possible. And I understand, like I live in San Francisco, lots of people, live in kind of studio apartments where their bed is their couch, is their table, is their office desk. And so, we need to try to understand that it's not so easy for everyone, but we want to try to make it as much as possible a shrine to sleep. So that means you want a bed that's comfortable, you want a bedroom that's dark, quiet, and cool, and you want to use the bed just for sleep and sex, is what we say. That's like, if those are the only things that go on in the bed. Other things should be moved out if possible to ensure that your body knows what's supposed to happen there. And then if you find that you're unable to sleep, you don't want to create this conditioned arousal. So we always say that, okay, if you wake up, totally normal to wake up out of bed, give yourself a chance to get back to sleep. This is the same as true when you try to go to sleep, though you don't want to get it in bed until you're sleepy, typically. But if you're unable to sleep, say after 20 minutes, you actually want to get out of bed. And what you're doing is you're kind of breaking the relationship between kind of your anxiety and the bed. And then when you get out of bed, you do things like I mentioned earlier to help get you sleepy, relaxed. And when you feel sleepy again, you get back in bed. And this is kind of repairing this relationship between sleepiness and the bed. And over time, this will get easier and easier, and the bed will be more of a robust environmental trigger for sleep. And so, and that's what we're looking for. We're trying to make that environment very predictable for your body so that it knows what to do next. And then we can also take advantage of your sleepiness balloon, right? And it's true that we can't survive without sleep and we can't stay up indefinitely. Certainly we can overcome it with anxiety or active brain, We can keep ourselves up, ask any parent of a young child. We can stay up for many nights, or those kind of things, but eventually we crash. And so one of the things that we often take advantage of is amping up that sleep balloon, because eventually, if you stay up long enough, you will feel sleepy, and oftentimes kind of your worries about never sleeping again will subside because you can feel this overwhelming sleepiness. And so in clinic, we often have people kind of track their sleep with a sleep diary, and then we identify kind of what is a bedtime that is more appropriate for them. Because oftentimes when people have insomnia, they spend lots of time in bed not sleeping. So, they may get 5 hours of sleep, but they spend 9 hours in bed, right? And so, we often kind of shrink that. But even for people that have just kind of a difficulty time falling asleep at night, or if they're waking up too much in the middle of the night, one thing that you can try is actually staying up a little bit later, and kind of taking the pressure off of getting in bed at a certain time at night, especially if you're not sleepy. And so, just as a kind of one way to address this, again, in a clinic, we would use kind of a more kind of, specific personalized approach based on your information. But, you could think about pushing your bedtime later, say by 1 hour, so that you can really feel that sleepiness. What we know is, maybe if you end up getting less total amount of sleep because you've kind of pushed your bedtime later, when your sleep is more continuous, it tends to feel better, even if it's less sleep than you feel like you maybe need. You want to keep that consistent wake time, right? So you're pushing it later, but you're still getting up at the same time. And that will make your bedtime sleepiness more reliable. And then in the short term, while you're trying to kind of, get this back into place, you need to try to embrace some of this daytime sleepiness, because you're probably getting less sleep than you maybe need. But you want to keep that sleepiness in your balloon, right? So you don't want to, you want to not nap, because that's kind of like snacking before dinner, or kind of sneaking some of that sleepiness that's building up in the balloon. So then it needs to stay up a little bit bigger, or you'll stay up longer so that you can get there. You don't want to consume excess caffeine. And then, of course, you want to use common sense and be safe. If you're feeling really, really sleepy, you want to make sure that you protect yourself and others around you. And so if that's happening, then you maybe don't want to use this particular strategy, and just use some common sense, as I said. Okay.